Silas Crowder slammed both hands flat on the Hartley kitchen table, so hard the coffee mugs jumped. "Sign it, Walter." His voice didn't rise. That was the worst part. Men who shouted gave you room to push back. Silas Crowder spoke the way a boot comes down on a snake-quiet final certain. "Sign the deed over tonight, or my men start moving cattle off your north pasture by sunrise." Every last head. Legal as Sunday morning. Elowen Hartley stood in the doorway holding a dish towel she'd forgotten she was holding. She was 21 years old, and she had never once in her life wanted to disappear into a floorboard until that exact second. Her father's hand was shaking. If that were you standing there, your father's hand, trembling over a paper that meant losing everything your family had ever built, what would you do? Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and tap the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Every like helps this channel reach someone who needs it. Now let's go back to that kitchen in Raven Hollow. Colorado, 1,876, because what happened next changed everything. The Hartley Ranch had been bleeding for 3 years before that night. Nobody talks about what a slow financial death actually looks like from the inside. People hear drought and debt, and they picture something clean, a sad headline, a family packing a wagon, moving on. What it actually looked like was Elowen's father eating less so she could eat more, and both of them pretending not to notice. It looked like the sound of her mother's sewing machine going until 2 in the morning for mending jobs that paid almost nothing. It looked like watching your prize bull sold for a third of what he was worth because you needed the cash by Thursday. 3 consecutive summers without enough rain had turned the Hartley grazing land from decent Colorado grass into something closer to cracked pottery. The cattle they'd started with 62 healthy heads had dwindled to 19 sickly ones. The banknote was due. The second banknote was overdue. And Silas Crowder, who owned the largest dry goods operation in Raven Hollow and had his fingers in half the valley's finances, had quietly bought both notes from the original lenders. Walter Hartley was 54 years old and looked 70. He'd built that ranch with his own hands starting when he was 26, hauled timber, dug post holes, fought off one early frost that nearly took everything, and survived. He was not a weak man. He was an exhausted one, which is a completely different thing, and far more dangerous, because exhausted men make decisions they can never take back. Elowen had come home from helping their neighbor missus. Aldridge, with a difficult birth, one of the Aldridge milk cows, not a glamorous task, but it was work and it kept her useful, kept her from sitting in this house thinking too hard. She'd come through the back door smelling like hay and lanolin, and she'd heard Crowder's voice before she even got the door fully closed. She should have walked back out. She knew that later. She stood there instead. "I'm not signing the ranch over to you, Silas." Her father's voice was steady. She loved him for that. Even with his hand shaking, his voice was steady. "We had an agreement. 60 days, 43 days. Crowder picked up the paper and looked at it like it bored him. He was a heavy man, not fat exactly, but the kind of solid that comes from never once in his life feeling uncertain. Silver-haired, well-dressed, even out here on a weeknight visit, with the kind of soft hands that had never done work he couldn't pay someone else to do. "You've got 17 days left on paper, Walter, and 17 days from now you'll be exactly where you are right now, only with 17 fewer days to make peace with it. I'm offering you something better." Better. Her father said the word the way you'd say something that tasted wrong. "Clean settlement. I take the deed. I forgive both notes. That's $1,100 in debt. Gone. You keep your household property and your personal effects. Your horses. I'll even let you stay in the house through winter. Consider it a rental arrangement while you make other plans." Crowder set the paper down and smoothed it with 2 fingers. "That's a generous offer, and you know it. That land was my father's. And now it's collateral you can't cover." Crowder's voice didn't change. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Elowen walked into the kitchen. She hadn't planned to. Her feet made the decision without consulting the rest of her. Crowder looked up, and something moved across his face, not quite surprise, more like a man recalibrating a calculation he'd already run. "Miss Hartley." He nodded once, courteous. like this was a social call. Mr. Crowder. She set the dish towel on the counter because holding it suddenly felt foolish. Late for a business visit. Business doesn't keep bankers' hours. Neither does conscience, she said, but I notice you're here anyway. Her father made a small sound, warning or admiration, she wasn't sure which. Crowder looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he picked up his hat from the table, turned it once in his hands, and smiled. Not a warm smile, the kind a chess player uses when he's seen 4 moves ahead and is simply waiting for you to catch up. Give your father the night to think it over, he said. I'll expect an answer by end of week. He looked at Walter one more time. Don't take too long. Offers like this have a way of expiring. He let himself out. The kitchen felt bigger after he left. Emptier too. Elowen sat down at the table across from her father. He was staring at the paper Crowder had left behind. The oil lamp was burning low. They'd been rationing fuel, and in that dim light her father looked hollowed out in a way that scared her more than Crowder's smooth threats had. Pop-on't. He held up a hand, not unkind, just finished. The way a man looks when he's been carrying something so long. His arms have gone numb and he can't feel the weight anymore, but he also can't put it down. Don't tell me we'll find a way. We've been finding ways for 3 years. She didn't say it, because he was right. She sat there with him in the quiet for a long time, listening to the windwork at the corners of the house. It was 3 days later that she heard the name for the first time in the context of her own life, as opposed to the whispered warnings she'd been hearing since she was a girl. Rhett Calder. She'd grown up hearing that name used the way you use a cautionary tale. Don't ride onto Calderland. Don't cross Calder in business. Don't ever give him reason to notice you. The man owned more territory than anyone else in the valley, ran his operation with a crew of hands who were loyal to a degree that people found unsettling, and had a reputation for seeing to it that anyone who worked against him found themselves facing consequences they couldn't quite trace back to him directly. 3 families had left Ravenhollow in the last decade with their finances in ruins, and the common thread was some earlier conflict with Calder. A feed merchant who'd cheated one of his cowboys ended up with his business mysteriously losing suppliers. A competing rancher who'd tried to claim water rights on land bordering Calder territory found himself facing a series of legal challenges that drained his savings down to nothing. Nobody had proof of anything. That was the thing about Rhett Calder. There was never proof. There was only the pattern. And there was only the name that people said quietly, the way you'd speak of a storm that was still a county away, but moving in your direction. The Black Wolf of Ravenhollow. She was in the general store when she heard Mrs. Pruitt tell the story again, because Mrs. Pruitt told it often of how young Tom Briggs had made the mistake of letting Calder cattle drift onto his land without sending word promptly, and how within a season Tom Briggs had moved his family to Denver under circumstances nobody ever explained fully. The man has no mercy, Mrs. Pruitt said, lowering her voice, even though the nearest Calder ranch hand was presumably 10 miles away. None. Cold as January iron, that one. Elowen had bought her flour and left without comment. She'd heard that story 4 times. She'd also heard conflicting versions, one where Tom Briggs had actually tried to rebrand 2 of Calder's cattle before the drift issue came up, which somewhat changed the moral weight of the thing. But in Ravenhollow, the clean version traveled faster. She came home to find a man she didn't recognize sitting in the good chair in their front room. He stood when she entered. That surprised her. Men with power, the kind she'd just been hearing about, didn't typically stand when a rancher's daughter walked in from the store with flour under her fingernails. Rhett Calder was taller than she'd imagined, which was strange because she hadn't consciously imagined him at all. He was lean in the way working men get lean not from want, but from use. Sun-darkened skin, dark hair going gray at the temples. He'd removed his hat, which sat on his knee. His eyes were she couldn't quite say. She looked for cruelty in them the way you check a room for a fire before you enter, and she didn't immediately find it. What she found was something more like careful attention. He was watching her, the way you watch something you're trying to understand rather than something you're trying to intimidate. She didn't trust that. Careful attention from powerful men had a way of serving their own purposes. Miss Hartley, his voice was even, not performing anything. Mr. Calder. She looked at her father, who was standing near the window, not looking at either of them. Her stomach dropped. Papa, what is this? Walter Hartley turned around, and she saw it on his face before he said a single word. That particular look a person gets when they've made a decision they know is wrong and are trying to locate the version of it that is merely necessary. Sit down, Ellie. I'll stand. Her father closed his eyes briefly. Rhett has made an offer. Rhett, she repeated the first name. That detail alone told her something. The two men were not strangers. She turned to look at Calder directly. He didn't look away. What kind of offer? Calder spoke for himself. She'd learned later that he almost always spoke for himself. He had very little use for intermediaries or softening language. The kind that solves your father's debt problem entirely. Both banknotes forgiven, the operating costs for the next 2 seasons covered. Your livestock replaced with healthy stock from my herd. He paused. In exchange for your hand in marriage. The flour sack slipped from her fingers. She didn't pick it up. She stood there in her own front room and looked at the stranger with the quiet eyes and the terrible name. And she understood in one single crystalline moment that her father had already said yes. The decision had already been made. The negotiation she'd walked into was already complete. Papa, her voice came out steadier than she felt. Papa, look at me. Walter Hartley looked at her. His eyes were wet. He didn't blink. You sold me. She didn't say it with rage. She said it the way you'd state a fact you'd found written somewhere and couldn't find a way to dispute. I saved the ranch. His voice broke on the last word. The ranch. She looked around the room, the worn furniture her mother had picked out, the quilt on the arm of the chair, the photograph on the mantel that was the only image she had of her grandmother. Papa, the ranch is just land and wood. Your grandfather's land. He looked at the floor. His wood, and she had nothing left to say to that. Because she understood it. She didn't excuse it. She would spend a long time not excusing it, but she understood the particular shape of his grief and how it had bent him toward this. She looked at Calder again. He had remained standing. He had remained still, the way a man stays still when he's decided the right thing to do is wait and let other people's emotions find their own edges. And what do I get from this arrangement, she asked. Because she was not going to dissolve. She was not going to weep in front of this man and give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd purchased someone broken. Besides a husband I've never met and a reputation I've spent my whole life hearing nightmares about. Something moved in his expression. Not offense. Not amusement. She couldn't name it. Your father keeps the ranch, he said. Your family keeps its dignity. You get a home that won't fall down around you this winter. He picked up his hat from his knee and turned it once in his hands. She would later recognize this as a habit, something he did when he was thinking. I won't pretend that's everything you'd want. No, she said. You're right, it isn't. I know. The directness of it stopped her. She'd expected justification, persuasion, the practiced smoothness of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted and had developed a method for making it palatable. He offered none of that. He simply acknowledged what it was. The wedding will be Saturday, Walter said from the window. He was back to looking at the glass, at nothing. Reverend Mason has agreed. Saturday was 4 days away. 4 days to mourn a future, she'd been quietly, carefully building in her imagination nothing grand, nothing dramatic, just the ordinary hope that someday she'd choose her own life and then pack whatever would fit in a trunk and walk into a stranger's house and call it home. She picked up the flour sack from the floor. She didn't know why. It was just something to do with her hands. I'll need my horse, she said. She comes with me, Calder nodded.
Of course, and I'll need to know what is expected of me.
She kept her voice even, kept her eyes on him, made herself hold the weight of his attention without flinching. Specifically, not in general terms. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she became aware of her own heartbeat. I'll tell you before Saturday, he said. You deserve that much. She wanted to say something cutting. She wanted to say that deserving had very little to do with anything in this room, in this negotiation, in this life she was apparently about to begin. But she held it in, because spending her anger here wouldn't change a single thing, and she had a feeling she was going to need it later. Calder put his hat on, nodded to her father, and walked out. Elowen stood in her front room in the house where she'd grown up, holding a sack of flour, and did not cry. She had 4 days. She spent the first one furious. She spent the second one practical mending clothes, cleaning her good boots, going through her mother's jewelry box and choosing what she would take, trying to think about this the way a sensible person would, and failing entirely because no amount of practicality could make this sensible. The third day, Calder returned, alone as promised. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat off, and he told her plainly what he expected. She was not required to share his bed. He said this first, directly, and she had to work to keep her expression neutral because the relief was so sharp it almost embarrassed her. He would give her her own room. He would not force anything. What he expected, that she run his household with the authority of a true partner, not a kept woman. That she be honest with him, that if she disagreed with something he did, she say so to his face rather than complain to others. That's all, she asked. That's enough, he said. She studied him across the table in the same kitchen where Crowder had sat 3 days ago with such smooth confidence, and she tried to find the predator everyone described. She looked for the cruelty, the contempt, the casual assumption of ownership. What she found instead was a tired man who spoke without decoration and looked at her like she was a person rather than a transaction. She didn't trust it. She wasn't stupid enough to trust it, but she noted it. The wedding on Saturday lasted 20 minutes. Reverend Mason said the words. Her father held her arm so tightly she'd have a bruise by evening. She said "I do" in a voice that carried and did not shake, because she had decided the night before that whatever else she lost in this arrangement, she was not losing her spine. Rhett Calder said "I do" quietly, almost gently, and then she was his wife. And then they rode in near silence the 14 miles to the Calder ranch, her mare tied to the back of his wagon, the Colorado late afternoon throwing long shadows across land she didn't know, and was now somehow supposed to call her own. She watched the back of his shoulders the whole ride and tried to read something in the set of them. Triumph, satisfaction, anything that would confirm what she believed about him. His shoulders just said, "Man who has ridden this road 1,000 times and is thinking about something she couldn't see." When they arrived, the ranch was larger than she'd allowed herself to imagine. Not extravagant, there was no extravagance here, no ornament for its own sake, but solid. Built to last, built to mean something. A woman came out of the main house, Mrs. Danforth, the housekeeper, 60s, no nonsense as a post hole, who looked Elowen up and down with the frank assessment of someone who had zero interest in pretending. "You'll want to see your room," Mrs. Danforth said. "Not our room. Your room." Elowen glanced at Rhett. He was already handing the horses off to a young ranch hand, already moving back into the rhythms of this place. Already himself again, in a way that told her the formality of the last 4 days had cost him something too, though she couldn't have said what. She followed Mrs. Danforth inside. Her room was at the end of the hall. Clean, a real bed, a real window facing east, a small writing desk with a lamp. Not lavish. But hers, she sat on the edge of the bed and put her hands in her lap and looked at the window and thought, "All right then, this is where I am now. Figure out what to do with it." She was not a woman who stayed still for long. It was her worst quality and her best one, depending on who you asked. She'd figure out what to do with it. She just needed a night to be furious first. She didn't sleep well that first night. The bed was fine, better than fine. Actually, which was its own kind of irritation, because she'd been prepared to endure discomfort and instead found herself lying on a mattress that was softer than anything she'd slept on since her mother was alive, staring at a ceiling she didn't recognize while the sounds of an unfamiliar ranch settled around her. Different creaks, different wind patterns against different walls. The horses in a barn that was 40 yards farther from the house than she was used to. She was awake before sunrise. Old habit, the Hartley ranch had demanded early rising, and her body hadn't gotten the news that circumstances had changed. She dressed in the dark, found her way to the kitchen by memory of the brief walk she'd taken the evening before, and had the stove going and coffee started before Mrs. Danforth appeared in the doorway in her wrapper and stopped short. The older woman looked at the stove, looked at Elowen. looked at the coffee. "I do the kitchen," Mrs. Danforth said. "Not hostile. Just informational, I know," Elowen said. "Couldn't sleep. I needed something to do with my hands." She paused. "I'll stay out of your way once the sun's up, Mrs." Danforth considered this for a moment, then walked to the cabinet, took down 2 cups, and set them both on the counter without another word. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it wasn't rejection either. They drank their coffee in silence while the sky outside went from black to gray to the particular pale gold that comes just before the Colorado sun clears the eastern ridge. Elowen wrapped both hands around her cup and watched the window and thought about exactly nothing, which was the closest thing to peace she was likely to find that morning. She heard him before she saw him boots on the porch, the particular sound of a man who doesn't waste steps. Rhett came through the back door already dressed for work. Hat in hand, stopped when he saw her at the table and absorbed the situation without any visible surprise. "You're up," he said. "I am." He looked at the coffee pot. Mrs. Danforth was already pouring a 3rd cup. He sat down at the far end of the table with the ease of a man who had sat at this table 10,000 times, and he drank his coffee and didn't say anything else, and neither did she. And after about 3 minutes of this, Elowen realized that the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was just silence. He wasn't filling it with performance, and he wasn't using it to unsettle her. She didn't know what to do with a man like that. She filed it away. The first week was a series of small collisions with her own assumptions. She had expected to be kept inside, managed, decorative, removed from any decision that actually mattered. Instead, on her second morning, Rhett knocked on her bedroom door before breakfast and asked if she wanted to ride the north fence line with him. Not an order, an actual question with a pause afterward that left real room for no. She said yes because she was not going to spend her days in this house pretending to be someone's idea of a proper wife. She said yes because she needed to understand the land she was now attached to, whether she liked it or not. And she said yes because something about that quiet knock, that genuine pause, made her curious enough to override her caution for one morning. The north fence line took 3 hours. Rhett pointed out landmarks, water sources, which sections of fence were due for replacement and why, where the soil changed and what that meant for grazing rotation. He didn't explain things to her the way men often explain things to women slowly, with pauses for comprehension, with that slightly elevated enunciation that said, "I'm simplifying this for you." He explained it the way he'd explain it to any competent person who was new to specific terrain. She asked questions, real ones. He answered them without making the questions feel like impositions. By the time they turned back toward the main house, she had a better picture of the operation than she'd managed to construct from 2 days of observation. She also had one more thing she hadn't expected to have: a grudging, minimal, entirely provisional sense that this man might be worth paying more careful attention to. She didn't say that. She wasn't going to say that. But she thought it, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge she'd thought it. The crew was harder to read than Rhett was. There were 11 ranch hands living on the property 8 full-time, 3 seasonal who'd stayed on through an informal arrangement Rhett had apparently offered at the end of the summer. They ranged from a boy of about 17 named Cody, who turned red any time Elowen spoke to him directly, to an old man called Fetch, who had a face like a relief map of everywhere he'd ever been, and had worked Calderland since before Rhett inherited it. They were courteous, they were careful, and they watched her with the particular wariness of people who have organized their loyalty around one person and are now waiting to see what category she falls into: threat, irrelevance, or something else. She'd grown up around working men. She knew this kind of caution, and she knew the only thing that dissolved it was time and demonstrated competence. So she didn't try to charm them. She learned their names and used them correctly. She picked up tasks without being asked. When the wagon came back from town with supplies that needed unloading, she unloaded supplies. When the kitchen needed an extra pair of hands for the midday meal, because Mrs. Danforth fed 11 men and didn't have magic powers Elowen provided them without discussion. On the 8th day, Fetch tipped his hat to her when she walked past the barn. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. On the 10th day, something happened that she hadn't anticipated. She was helping Mrs. Danforth with the mending. There was always mending on a working ranch. Always something torn or worn through when the door opened and a young woman came in supporting a boy of about 4 on her hip, and behind her were 2 more children. And the young woman had clearly been crying and was trying very hard not to be doing that in front of anyone. Elowen looked at Mrs. Danforth. "Marta," Mrs. Danforth said. To Elowen quietly, wife of Pete Calloway, one of the hands. Marta Calloway sat the boy down and looked at the floor and said, "Pete's hurt." He was working the south pasture and the wire she stopped. Breathed. He got tangled in the new barbed wire we were putting up. His arm. "The doctor in town says he'll be all right, but he can't work for at least 3 weeks, and I don't know what." She stopped again. The boy on her hip had grabbed a fistful of her collar and was looking around the kitchen with the wide-eyed imperviousness of the very young. Elowen was already getting up. "Sit down," she said. Not unkindly, but without negotiation. She went to the stove and poured the woman a cup of coffee and set it in front of her. 3 weeks isn't 3 months. Pete still has his arm, which means Pete still has his future. "What do you need right now?" Marta blinked at her, like she'd expected to be dismissed or redirected or handed to someone else. I mean the wages. I don't know if Mr. Calder will. I'll speak to him," Elowen said. It came out of her mouth before she'd fully made the decision. She watched Marta's face register something between relief and uncertainty, and she committed to it. Tonight. Don't worry about wages this week. She told herself she was making a promise she had no actual authority to keep. She told herself she'd find out very quickly whether this marriage was what Rhett claimed it was, or what her gut still sometimes warned her it might be. She found Rhett that evening in the room he used as an office. She'd learned by now that he worked the land during daylight hours and handled the business of it after dark. Account books and correspondence and supply orders spread across a desk that was buried under paper in the organized chaos of a man who understood every item on it perfectly and would have been helpless if someone had cleaned it up. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. "Pete Calloway," she said. "His wife came to the house today. I heard about the accident." He set his pen down. "Doc Reeves says 3 weeks. She's worried about wages." He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his expression that she was starting to be able to read, a slight shift that meant I had already thought of this, but I'm interested that you brought it to me. "His wages continue," he said. "I'll let Pete know tomorrow." Stood in the doorway. "That's it? That's it. He's an injured ranch hand." "You're not going to." She gestured vaguely, unsure of what she was even arguing against. "I'm not going to what?" His voice was level, genuinely curious. "People say she caught herself. Reformulated. The reputation is that you cut people loose when they stop being useful." Rhett looked at her for a long moment. He picked up his pen again, turned it once between his fingers, set it back down. "Marta and Pete have 3 children and a 4th coming," he said. "Pete's a good hand who got tangled in wire doing work I assigned him." "His wages continue." "That's not generosity, Mrs. Calder. That's just what's right." He paused. "Who told you I'd do different?" She thought about every whispered story she'd grown up with, every warning, every careful avoidance of the name Calder in public spaces. "Everyone," she said honestly. He nodded, like he wasn't surprised. Like this was information he'd received before and had stopped being wounded by. "Everyone has their reasons," he said. She didn't know what to do with that answer, so she said goodnight and went to bed, and lay there in the dark, thinking about what kind of man has a community-wide reputation for cruelty and doesn't seem to feel much compulsion to correct it. Either he was very good at appearing decent, or the reputation was wrong. She wasn't ready to commit to either conclusion. It was in the library that things started shifting most significantly. She found it by accident on a Sunday afternoon. Rhett had ridden out to check on Pete's progress, Mrs. Danforth had her afternoon to herself, and the house was quiet in a way that felt almost like permission. She opened a door she hadn't opened before, expecting a storage room, and found instead a room-lined floor to ceiling with books. Not decorative books arranged for impression. Used books. Spines cracked. Pages dog-eared. margins annotated in a handwriting she recognized now as Rhett's tight, efficient, no flourish. She stood in the doorway for a moment, like she'd caught the house doing something private. Then she walked in and started reading spines. He had everything from agricultural surveys of the territory to Charles Dickens to a battered Latin grammar that looked like it had been used until it nearly gave up. There were land management texts with sections underlined, legal documents tucked between volumes, a handwritten ledger that turned out to be a personal record of water levels in the valley streams going back 11 years. 11 years, she pulled that one out and sat down with it. Someone had been tracking in obsessive detail every fluctuation in the valley's water supply. Rainfall records, stream depth measurements, seasonal patterns. The handwriting was Rhett's. The notes in the margins were Rhett's. This was not a man checking water levels because he had to. This was a man who understood, on some deep and probably difficult level. That water was the difference between life and failure in this valley, and had spent over a decade documenting it, so he would understand it better than anyone else. She was still reading it when she heard his boots in the hallway. He appeared in the doorway, saw her in his library with his water ledger open in her lap, and stopped. She expected she wasn't sure what she expected. Territorial irritation, maybe. Some version of this is my space, the 71 drought, she said, holding up the page. You lost nearly a third of your herd. He came into the room. Sat in the chair across from hers with the ease of someone returning to a familiar place. 31%, he said. It's why I started tracking. I thought if I understood the patterns better, I could see the bad years coming earlier. Can you sometimes? He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, and looked at the ledger. What made you come in here? I thought it was a storage room. She looked around at the shelves. I wasn't expecting this. Most people aren't. Something in the way he said it, without self-pity, but not without awareness, made her look at him more directly than she had before. You went to school somewhere? She asked. The Latin grammar. Something that might have been amusement crossed his face. It didn't quite make it to a smile, but it came close. 2 years at a school back east. My father sent me when I was 15. I came home when he died and never went back. Was that hard? He thought about it, actually thought about it, rather than giving her the reflexive answer. The coming home was. The leaving wasn't. I didn't fit there particularly well. But you kept reading. What else would I do with evenings? After that, the library became a kind of neutral territory between them, a place where the formal distance of their arrangement relaxed slightly, where conversation happened not because protocol required it, but because they were two people in the same room who both happened to find things worth discussing. She asked him about the water records. He asked what she'd noticed about the grazing rotation pattern she'd observed on their rides. She challenged something he said about the drought cycles, and he didn't dismiss it. He argued back, and they spent 45 minutes disagreeing in a way that was more genuinely engaging than any conversation she'd had in years. She walked out of that room on the third evening, thinking something she didn't particularly want to think. She was starting to look forward to it. This was alarming. She didn't look away from the alarm. She was not built for self-deception, but she held it carefully. The way you hold something that's either valuable or dangerous, and you haven't yet determined which. She was not falling in love with Rhett Calder. She was learning to read him. Those were different things. She kept telling herself they were different things. The question that still scraped at her, the one she couldn't file away or argue herself past, was the disasters. The pattern, the families that had lost everything, and the trail of misfortune that led back, in every whispered accounting, to some conflict with this man. She decided to look into it herself, because she was not a woman who could sit with an unanswered question and simply manage it. She started with Fetch. The old ranch hand was not easy to talk to. He communicated primarily in observations, rarely in full sentences, and had the quality of a man who'd seen enough of people's motives to be unimpressed by most of them. But he'd worked this land for 30 years. If anyone knew the history from ground level, it was Fetch. She found him mending a bridle on the bench outside the barn one afternoon, and sat down on the fence nearby and didn't say anything for a while because she'd figured out by this point that Fetch respected patience. He mended. She watched. The silence stretched comfortably. "You've been here longer than anyone," she said eventually. "Longer than most things," he said, not looking up. "I want to understand something." She kept her voice neutral. "Tillman family. They lost their ranch 6 years ago. People in town say I know what people in town say." He set the bridle down, looked at her with the particular directness of the very old and the very young, both of whom have given up on prettying things up. The Tillman boy started that fire himself. Insurance money. Only it wasn't insured for nearly what he owed, and the whole thing came down around his ears. Calder offered to buy him out fair price before any of that happened. Tillman said no, tried the insurance gamble, lost. He picked the bridle back up. Calder's name got on the story because Tillman needed someone to blame, and Calder was an easy target. "That's how it works," Elowen sat with this. "And the Morrison feed merchant?" Ran a short-weight scale for 3 years. When Calder had him checked, he was short-weighting everybody, not just Calder hands. Lost his license. Fetch's hands kept moving on the leather. Calder didn't take any action himself, filed the complaint, let the territory sort it out. By the time the dust settled, Morrison moved on and left Calder's name attached to his troubles. "You're saying the reputation is. I'm saying the reputation grew." He looked at her again. "Like weeds grow. You don't plant them, but you don't always pull them either, and sometimes there's a reason you leave them." She turned that over in her head. A reputation for ruthlessness, left uncorrected, deliberately cultivated as a kind of protection. A man who had learned early that being feared was safer than being legible. "Why wouldn't he correct it?" she asked. Fetch shrugged the small, eloquent shrug of a man who thinks some things are obvious. "Fear protects property better than offense. In a territory where the law gets there slow and justice comes slower, a man with a frightening name has something the law can't give him." He paused. "Doesn't mean it doesn't cost something." She thought about that for a long time walking back to the house. She was still thinking about it 3 days later, when the situation with Silas Crowder rose to the surface again. She'd been in Raven Hollow with Mrs. Danforth, doing the kind of careful, comparative shopping that stretches a supply budget, when she overheard 2 women at the dry goods counter discussing the latest story making its way through town. According to this version, a man named Garrett, formerly a Calder ranch hand, had been beaten and crippled on Rhett's order for stealing. He was now living outside of town, barely managing his livelihood destroyed. Elowen had heard the name Garrett before, vaguely, in a different context. She couldn't place it. She asked Mrs. Danforth on the ride home. The older woman's mouth went thin. "Garrett rode for us 2 summers ago. He wasn't beaten, he was drunk, and tried to ride a horse he had no business on, in the dark, and the horse put him on the ground on his shoulder. He was lucky it wasn't his head." She kept her eyes on the road. Mr. Calder paid his medical expenses and arranged work for him at the lumber operation north of town. Light work could do it one-armed. Then why is the story? Because Garrett told a different version. Mrs. Danforth's voice was flat as slate. "I don't know why. Could be shame, could be something else." Mr. Calder knew the truth and chose not to put Garrett out to dry over it. She glanced at Elowen. He could have. The man was lying about him in public. He could have made Garrett's life considerably more difficult. He didn't, because it would look like retaliation. Because it would be retaliation, Mrs. Danforth said. Mr. Calder doesn't enjoy that kind of thing, no matter what people say. Elowen looked out at the road unspooling ahead of them. She was beginning to see the shape of something she hadn't seen before, not a monster wearing a respectable face, but a man who had built a wall of frightening stories around himself because the alternative was being exposed, and who was now so thoroughly trapped inside that wall that he couldn't dismantle it without losing the protection it provided. She was beginning to suspect that someone had been very deliberately adding bricks to that wall, and she was beginning to have a very clear idea of whose hands were doing the building. She got her confirmation at the end of October. Rhett had driven into town to deal with a supply dispute, and she had gone along not because he'd asked her to, but because she was finished with being managed, and she wanted to see how he operated in public. They were outside the grain merchant's when Crowder appeared on the opposite side of the street with two men she didn't recognize. And Crowder saw Rhett, and something moved across his face, not fear exactly, but its cousin. A rapid recalculation. He came across the street anyway. That took a certain kind of nerve or a certain kind of stupidity, and with men like Crowder, it was usually the same thing. Calder, he nodded. His eyes moved to Elowen and the new missus. Calder, settling in all right, are you? Quite well, Elowen said pleasantly. Like they were discussing weather. Crowder turned back to Rhett. I heard about the Garrett situation. Shame how these things get around. He didn't sound like he thought it was a shame. He sounded like a man reporting his own work. Rhett looked at Crowder the way you look at something you've been watching for a long time and are finally confirming what you thought you saw. They do get around, he said, almost like someone's helping them along. A beat of silence. Things travel on their own in a small valley, Crowder said. Some things, Rhett said. Others need carrying. The two men looked at each other across about 4 feet of October Colorado air, and Elowen felt the weight of something that had been building between them for years, something that had nothing to do with her and predated her by a long distance. And she understood in that moment that the war between these two men was not casual or incidental, it was fundamental, and it was about water and land, and the question of who would eventually control both. Silas Crowder had been fighting it with stories and shadows, while Rhett had been fighting it with silence and reputation, and neither of them had landed the decisive blow yet. She also understood that she was standing inside that fight now, whether she'd chosen to be or not. Crowder left without saying anything further. The two men with him followed. Rhett watched them go with the still, patient attention of a man who is not done with a problem and knows it. That was him, Elowen said. Not a question. Rhett was quiet for a moment. I don't have proof of anything. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. Something in his expression that she'd been slowly learning to read a kind of recognition, the look of a man seeing something he'd hoped for but hadn't entirely counted on. Yes, he said. That's him. She nodded, filed it away alongside everything else. They were riding home in the wagon when the storm caught them. Came from the west with the sudden violence of late-season weather that has been holding back. For too long the sky went green. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the space of 10 minutes. And the rain arrived not gradually but all at once, the way someone throws a bucket rather than tilts it. The horses pulled reliably, but the road turned to mud fast, and Rhett slowed them and leaned forward over the reins and said nothing, concentrating. And Elowen held onto the seat rail and watched the lightning crack across the ridgeline and thought, this is exactly what being in this valley feels like. Everything fine, and then the sky falls. They made it to a stand of cottonwoods that provided minimal shelter and stopped there, pulling the horses in, and there was nothing to do but wait it out. The lightning was close enough that the thunder was immediate, not the rolling kind, but the sharp crack and boom that makes your chest vibrate. Rhett glanced over at her, checking. She met his eyes to indicate she was fine. And something in the steadiness of the look that passed between them, the mutual recognition of two people who have decided not to perform fear in front of each other, shifted something she'd been holding carefully for weeks. It didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with any particular drama. It was just a shift in the weight of things. Like when a door that's been stuck finally swings open, not broken, not forced, just no longer latched. The rain came down for 40 minutes and then moved east. They drove the rest of the way home in the particular clarity that comes after a hard storm, the air sharp and cleaned out, the sky going from bruised purple to the pale nothing of early evening. He helped her down from the wagon. He'd done this before, but she'd always stepped away quickly, maintaining that careful distance she'd decided was necessary. This time she didn't step away immediately. She stood there on the muddy ground, his hand still loosely holding hers, and looked up at him in the fading light. "Why me?" she asked, the question she'd been carrying since the kitchen that first night, the one she'd never quite found the moment to ask directly. Of all the women in this territory who weren't looking at your name with suspicion, why me? He held her gaze. That quiet, careful attention of his that she'd learned was not coldness, but its opposite, a man so accustomed to being misread that he'd learned to watch very carefully before trusting what he was seeing. "Because you didn't try to make me into something easier to hold," he said. "Even when you were scared of me, you looked right at me." She didn't have an answer for that. She didn't need one. She took her hand back. Not because she wanted to, but because she wasn't ready yet. She was honest enough with herself to know she wasn't ready yet. And she walked into the house and stood in the hallway for a moment, with her hand pressed flat against the wall, and felt the particular terror of discovering that a door you'd thought was sealed had been open for some time without your permission. She was not someone who lost her bearings. She had always known where the ground was. This was the first time in her life she'd looked down and found it wasn't where she'd left it. It took her most of the night to find it again. And when she did, it was in a slightly different place than before, not the ground of resistance and suspicion and careful management, but something newer. Something she didn't have a name for yet, but recognized by the way it felt in her chest when she heard his boots on the floor in the morning. Outside, the valley was clean and cold, and the streams were running full after the rain. Inside, Elowen Hartley Calder lay in her room, listening to the sounds of a house that was just beginning. Not completely. Not without its complications, to feel like something she didn't entirely want to leave. She found out she was pregnant on a Tuesday morning in early November, which was, as it happened, the same morning that the first reports came in about the fire. Mrs. Danforth knew before Elowen said a word the older woman had been watching the signs for 2 weeks, with the quiet attentiveness of someone who had seen this particular situation enough times to recognize it from across a room, and she set a cup of ginger tea on the table in front of Elowen without comment. And Elowen wrapped her hands around it and stared at the steam and tried to locate her feelings about this development in the general vicinity of her chest, where feelings were supposed to live. She found several, all of them arriving at once, none of them simple. She was not unhappy. That was the first thing she admitted to herself, which then required admitting what it meant, which was that somewhere between the water ledger in the library and the storm on the road from town, and 11 weeks of learning to read a man that the entire valley had spent years misreading, she had arrived at a place she hadn't planned to arrive at. She was not unhappy about carrying Rhett Calder's child. That was a truth with considerable weight attached to it. She was also frightened, which was honest and appropriate, and she gave herself permission to be frightened without immediately talking herself out of it. She was still sitting with the tea when young Cody came to the back door with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that meant bad news before he opened his mouth. "Ma'am." He addressed her the way the crew had begun addressing her, without the careful uncertainty of the first weeks, with something closer to the directness they used with each other. "There's smoke coming from the Aldridge East pasture. Mr. Calder's already riding out. He says Cody stopped, recalibrated. He asked me to let you know." Elowen was on her feet before Cody finished the sentence. She was not going to sit in the house. She knew better than to ride to a fire in her condition. And she didn't. She wasn't reckless. She was practical. And the distinction mattered, but she climbed to the top of the water tower with a set of field glasses she'd appropriated from the library. And from that elevation, she could see the smoke column rising from the east thick, black at the base where it was still burning hard gray, and spreading at the top where the wind was taking it north. Too much smoke for a small accident, too organized. This was hay, she thought. Stored hay, burning all at once. Fetch appeared at the base of the water tower. 3 fields, he said, looking east without glasses. Aldridge, Pruitt, and the Morrison lease land, all burning same time. Same time, she repeated. Near enough. 3 adjacent fields, all burning simultaneously. She stood up there with the field glasses and the cold November wind in her face and felt the thing she'd been slowly assembling in her mind for 2 months click into its final position like the last piece of a lock sliding home. This was not accident. This was not coincidence. And she knew whose hands were behind it. She climbed down and went inside and sat at Rhett's desk in his office, the one she'd never sat at before, the one surrounded by his account books and his correspondence, and his 11 years of water records, and she started pulling files. Not carelessly. With the systematic attention she'd brought to every task on this ranch, the same attention she'd used on the grazing rotation and the supply budgets and the library books that had told her more about Rhett Calder than any story she'd ever heard in town. She was looking for the pattern. She found it inside of an hour. The 3 fields burning today bordered Calder land on the north side. The families who worked or leased them were already financially fragile, the Aldridges, because of 2 bad seasons, the Pruitts because of a legal dispute over their original deed, the Morrison lease because the man holding it had been struggling since before Elowen arrived in Raven Hollow. Their winter hay, now burning, represented their margin. Without it, their cattle would suffer through winter. Without their cattle, they would be forced to sell. And the land, when it came available, would be priced at distress rates. She thought about Fetch's words from weeks ago. Fear protects property better than a fence. And she thought about Crowder, standing across the street in town with that calculating look, with those 2 she'd never seen before and hadn't seen since. She thought about the fires and the ruined families, and the way misfortune had a habit in this valley of arranging itself along paths that led directly toward someone else's advantage. She was still at the desk when Rhett came home. He came through the door with soot on his jacket and exhaustion on his face, and stopped when he saw her sitting at his desk surrounded by his files, and for one moment she watched him decide how to respond to that. He decided to let it be. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough." He sat down in the chair across from her usual chair in the reversal, and pulled off his gloves. "All 3 fields are gone. The Aldridge barn took some damage before we got a line on it. Nobody hurt. It wasn't an accident." He looked at her. "No. The same time, Rhett. 3 fields, same time." "Someone set those fires, I know." His voice was flat and tired, and underneath the flatness was something harder, the particular anger of a man who has been patient for a long time and is approaching the edge of it. "They're going to say it was you." She said it directly because she had given up, somewhere in the last month, on softening things before she handed them to him. He didn't need that and didn't want it. The evidence will show up pointing at your men. That's how he works. You know that. Rhett looked at his hands. Already started. Ed Pruitt saw 2 men riding away from his field, and one of them was wearing a jacket like what Cody wears. Cody, who was 17 years old and had turned red every time Elowen spoke to him. "Cody was here this morning," she said. "He came to the door to tell me about the smoke." "I know that." Rhett's jaw was tight. "But Pruitt doesn't know it, and Pruitt is angry and scared, and he'll say what he saw." She leaned forward. "Then we tell them. We tell Pruitt. We tell all of them. It's one word against another. Then we give them more than one word." She pulled the file she'd assembled across the desk toward him. "Look at this. Look at the pattern of what's been sold in this valley over the last 8 years, and who bought it, and what preceded every sale." She watched his eyes move over the papers. "It's not you. It was never you. It's Crowder buying distressed land at prices nobody else would accept because nobody else knew the families were about to be desperate. And the families became desperate in the same way every time fire. Legal trouble, financial shock, and Crowder was always there immediately after, ready with an offer." Rhett was quiet for a long time. "You've been in my files," he said finally. "Yes. For how long today I needed to see it laid out." She paused. "Are you angry?" He looked up from the papers. Something moved across his face, the complicated expression of a man whose privacy has been breached by someone who used the breach to defend him. "No," he said, "I'm not angry." "Good." She sat back. "Because we need to figure out what to do next, and I have a thought about that, and I want you to hear it before you decide on your own approach." He looked at her with those careful, quiet eyes. "I'm listening." She told him what she thought. He didn't like it. That was, she would reflect later, an understatement. She told him they needed to open everything. Not just the evidence of Crowder's pattern, but Rhett's own records. Every financial transaction, every land purchase, every instance of assistance given, debt forgiven, wage continued through injury. Every piece of the hidden history of Rhett Calder that contradicted the Black Wolf story. "You want me to empty my pockets in public," he said. "I want you to show the valley who you actually are before Crowder finishes deciding who you're going to be. That's not how I operate. I know that. She kept her voice steady. How has operating the way you operate been working out lately? The silence that followed was the particular silence of a correct observation, landing in a place where it wasn't welcome. The reputation protects the ranch, he said. The words of a man repeating something he believed and was starting to see the limits of. The reputation is the weapon Crowder is using against you. She leaned forward again. Rhett, he doesn't have to prove you set those fires. He just has to make sure everyone already believes you're capable of it. You've handed him that. You've been handing him that for 15 years. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the sky was still faintly gray where the smoke had been, the late afternoon light unable to fully clear it. He stood there with his back to her, and she let him stand there because she understood this was not a small thing she was asking. She was asking him to dismantle something he'd spent years building, something that had kept him safe in a way that law enforcement in this territory absolutely had not. If we open the books, he said, without turning, and Crowder has people in place to discredit what they show, then we'll be no worse off than we are right now, with a burning field and a 17-year-old being described as your arsonist. She paused. But if it works, if people see what's actually in those records? It's not just the financial records. He turned around. If I open the private documents, the assistance payments, the arrangements I made quietly, then everyone knows. Every family I helped without making it public, they'll know I was watching over them without their knowledge. Some of them might find that disturbing, she said honestly, and some of them might find it different from what they expected. He looked at her for a long moment. That deep, considering look that she'd learned meant he was genuinely wrestling with something and wasn't going to resolve it quickly. You're asking me to trust people who have spent 15 years believing the worst about me. I'm asking you to give them something better to believe. She met his gaze. I'm asking you to trust me. The word landed between them, and she felt it land the weight of it, the particular significance it carried given what she'd said to him weeks ago on the road back from the storm, given the door that had swung open without announcement and hadn't swung back. Rhett came back to the desk. He sat down. He looked at the file she'd assembled and at his own records spread around her, his handwriting on every page. The Raven Hollow Town meeting is Friday, he said. I know. Crowder will be there. He'll already have a version of today ready. I know that too. He was quiet for another moment. Then he put both hands flat on the desk, not the way Crowder had put his hands on the Hartley kitchen table, not with force or threat, but with the finality of a man making a decision he's going to have to live with. All right, he said. She let out a breath she'd been holding. All right, she said back. The next 2 days were the hardest work of her life, and she had worked hard before. But this was a different kind of hard, the kind that doesn't tire your body but excavates you, that requires you to hold multiple competing truths at once and not let any of them collapse under the weight of the others. Rhett pulled every relevant document, account books going back 12 years, records of transactions, employment arrangements, assistance payments, medical expenses covered and debts forgiven, letters, legal documents, the water records she'd first found in the library, now annotated with additional context. He went through them with her at the desk in the evenings, explaining context she didn't have, and she organized them and built a sequence from them that told a story, not a flattering myth, not a justification, but a factual accounting of what had actually happened in Raven Hollow's Valley over the last 15 years, and who had actually been making what decisions. It was during this process, on the second evening, that she found the documents she hadn't expected. They were in a locked box in the bottom drawer of the desk, and Rhett unlocked it himself and set the contents in front of her without preamble, which told her he'd decided this was part of what needed to be shown rather than an accident of her discovery. Inside were letters. 6 of them, from various families: the Tillmans, the Morrisons, a family called the Garretts she hadn't encountered before. 2 others, and every letter was a thank you note. Not formal correspondence, personal letters. The Tillman one was written in a shaking hand by a woman who said that the quiet payment she'd received when her husband left had been the difference between feeding her children or not. The Morrison letter said something similar. The Garrett woman, different from the ranch hand called Garrett, she noted wrote 3 paragraphs that she clearly hadn't intended for anyone outside her immediate family to read, about what it meant that someone had paid her daughter's medical costs without asking for anything in return, or telling anyone about it. Elowen read all 6 letters. She set them down and looked at the desk surface for a moment. These families, she said carefully, the ones people say you destroyed. Some of them. His voice was even. Watching her, you helped them. After, I didn't destroy them in the first place. I know that. She looked up. But you helped them after. Quietly. And then let people continue believing the worst version. They needed help more than I needed to be right. He said it simply, without any performance of humility. Just a fact. She looked back at the letters. These can't go to the town meeting, she said. These are private, no. He shook his head. But the families can speak for themselves if they're willing. Some of them are still in the territory. She hadn't thought of that. She should have thought of that. Can you reach them before Friday? Pete Calloway's brother knows where the Tillman woman went, he said. I can have a rider out by morning. She nodded. Do it. He sent 3 riders at dawn on Thursday. Friday arrived with the particular bright coldness of a November day that has no patience for complications. The town meeting was held in the Raven Hollow Community Hall, which could fit perhaps 80 people comfortably, and was now attempting to hold 112, which told Elowen that word had spread faster and further than even she'd anticipated. She and Rhett arrived together. She'd considered whether that mattered, whether her presence would help or hurt, and decided that absent was a form of hiding, and she was not going to hide. She wore her good dress, the dark blue one, and her back was straight, and her face gave nothing away except attention. The room changed when they walked in, not dramatically. But she felt it, the shift in attention, the recalibration of a crowd that had been building its anticipation around one version of events suddenly confronting the principals. Crowder was already there. He stood near the front with 3 prominent ranchers she recognized as members of the valley's informal council. He had the look of a man at the top of an arrangement he'd carefully constructed, waiting for it to execute as designed. Ed Pruitt was there too. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s, and he was angry in the way of frightened people with a bright, desperate energy that had nowhere good to go. The meeting opened with the Valley Council leader, a man named Hartley, laying out the facts as currently understood. 3 fields burned, significant hay loss, winter supply compromised for 3 families. Eyewitness accounts suggesting Calder hands near the scene. Crowder took the floor before anyone else could. He was good at this. She'd known he would be a man didn't run the kind of operation he'd been running for, as long as he'd been running it without being good at the public performance of righteous concern. He talked about the safety of the valley, about the pattern of misfortune that had followed Calder's expansion, about the timing of the fires, so convenient for a man who needed those families to sell their land. He was careful he made no direct accusation, stated no fact he couldn't defend, but by the time he finished, the implication was so thick in the room you could have cut it and served it. Several people were nodding. Ed Pruitt said, loud from his seat, "My cattle go hungry this winter." "Somebody owes me an accounting." "You're right," Rhett said. The room went quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when something unexpected interrupts the established current. Crowder looked at Rhett with the slight narrowing of a man whose plan has just encountered weather. Rhett stood up. He was not a man given to speeches. Elowen knew this by now as well as she knew anything about him. He didn't enjoy being the center of a room's attention, didn't perform well for audiences, had spent 15 years arranging his affairs so he didn't need to. Standing up in that community hall in front of 112 people who mostly believed he was dangerous was costing him something real, and she could see it in the set of his jaw and the careful deliberateness of his movements. He set the account books on the council table, all of them. 12 years of records, organized by her hands over the last 2 days, flagged with paper markers indicating the relevant documents. "Everything's there," he said. "Every purchase I've made in this valley. Every land transaction, every business arrangement, every payment I've made or received." Going back to 1864, he looked at the council. I'd like you to review it. All of it, not selected pieces, all of it. Hartle looked at the pile of books. That'll take time, I know. Rhett looked at Crowder. I expect some people would rather it didn't happen. Crowder's expression didn't change. Transparency is commendable, he said smoothly. Of course, records can be arranged to tell any story a man chooses. They can, Rhett agreed. That's why I've asked some people to come and speak who aren't in my employ and never have been. The side door opened. Mrs. Clara Tillman came in first. She was 50 years old, heavy-set, wearing her Sunday dress, and she walked with the deliberate step of someone who had thought carefully about this decision and made it fully. Behind her was a younger man Elowen didn't recognize, and behind him, to her own surprise, was the man called Garrett, the former ranch hand who'd told a damaging story about Rhett for 2 years. Garrett looked terrible. Not physically, he'd recovered from his injury well enough, but in the particular way of a person who has been living with something they're not proud of and has decided today is the day to put it down. The room had shifted again. She could feel it, Mrs. Tillman spoke first, and she spoke for 9 minutes without notes, in a voice that didn't require the room to be quiet. To be heard it required it, and the room complied. She told the factual story of her family's financial collapse, which had nothing to do with Rhett Calder and everything to do with her husband's failed insurance scheme and his subsequent departure. She told about the payment she'd received quietly, without announcement, arranged through a third party that had kept her children fed through the winter of 1870. She said she'd been ashamed to speak publicly about it before because it required admitting her husband's choices. She was done being ashamed of someone else's choices. When she sat down, the younger man stood up. He was the Garrett woman's son, the one whose medical costs Rhett had covered. He was 22 years old, and he spoke briefly and factually. His sister had been treated. The bills had been paid. The arrangement had been made through a lawyer in the next county specifically, so his family wouldn't feel obligated to the Calders. Then Garrett stood up. The room was so quiet that Elowen could hear the November wind at the building's corners. Garrett was a big man, or had been the shoulder injury had changed his silhouette, left him slightly asymmetrical in the way of people whose bodies have had to renegotiate their own arrangements. He held his hat in both hands and looked at the floor for a moment before he looked up. I told a lie, he said. I told it more than once, and I told it to people who repeated it, and I'm here to say it out loud because it needs saying out loud. He told the truth. The whole truth, the drinking, the horse, the fall, the injury that was entirely his own doing, and the fact that Rhett had paid his medical costs and arranged his current work without requiring anything in return and without making any of it public. He said he'd told the other story because he was ashamed and because it was easier to have someone else to blame and because someone had encouraged him to tell it. He looked at Crowder when he said the last part. The room looked at Crowder too. Crowder's face had gone carefully neutral, the face of a man who has lost the high ground and is already working on the retreat. I can't prove who encouraged me, Garrett said. I'm not going to say something I can't prove. I'm just here to take back what I said that wasn't true. He sat down. Ed Pruitt, in his seat near the back, had gone from bright, furious energy to something quieter and harder to read. He was looking at the account books on the table. Hartle looked at Crowder. Mr. Crowder, you've been investing substantially in Valley land over the last 8 years. Your own records might benefit from the same transparency. I'm a private businessman, Crowder said. His voice had lost its earlier smoothness. Not dramatically, he was too controlled for drama, but enough to be noticeable. My transactions are legal, and I don't owe this assembly a personal accounting. No, Hartle agreed. But the pattern Mrs. Calder identified. He looked at Elowen, and the room looked at Elowen, and she held the attention without flinching and without performing anything. The pattern in the public land records is something the county assessor can verify independently. Crowder's 2 men near the wall exchanged a look. Elowen watched Crowder recalculate. She had seen him do it before in her father's kitchen, on the street in town, wherever his preferred narrative encountered unexpected resistance. was very fast at it, very smooth. He had probably survived 15 years of this particular game by being faster than his opponents at finding the new angle when the old one failed. What he hadn't planned for was an opponent who'd done the homework before the meeting. What he hadn't planned for was her. She stood up. She hadn't told Rhett she was going to do this. She'd made the decision in the last few minutes. Watching the room and watching Crowder and watching Hartle's careful neutrality. And she knew that what Rhett had done presenting records, bringing witnesses, had shifted the weight of things, but hadn't broken them. There was still a room full of frightened people who'd been given a story about Rhett Calder for 15 years and were being asked to release it in a single morning. That required something different. "I married Rhett Calder in October," she said. She didn't project loudly. She spoke at a volume that required the room to be quiet to hear her, and the room became quiet. "I married him because my father's ranch was failing, and Rhett offered to clear the debt. I want to be honest about that because I think honesty is the only thing worth being at this point." She let that sit for a moment. "I was afraid of him," she continued. "I'd grown up hearing the same things all of you have heard. I thought I was walking into a cage." She looked around the room at Pruitt, at the council, at Mrs. Tillman sitting with her hands folded, at Garrett with his hat in his lap. "What I found instead was a ranch where injured workers keep their wages, where the housekeeper has worked for the same family for 22 years because she's treated decently, where the crew argues with their boss when they think he's wrong, and he listens to them." She paused. "That's not the portrait of a monster. That's a man who's been easier to fear than to know." Crowder said from across the room, "A wife's account of her husband is exactly what it is," she said, "and the account books on that table are what they are, and the county land records are what they are, and what Mrs. Tillman said is what it is." She looked at him directly. "I'd be interested to hear what you have that outweighs all of that, Mr. Crowder." The room turned to look at him. He had no answer that would serve him. He left before the meeting was formally concluded, he and his two men walking out with the careful dignity of a man pretending he is choosing to leave rather than recognizing that the ground has collapsed under him. The community hall stayed in session for another 2 hours. The council reviewed the account books. They asked Rhett questions, and he answered them not easily, not smoothly, with the visible discomfort of a private man being required to be public, but completely and without evasion. Ed Pruitt, by the end of it, shook Rhett's hand, not warmly, but he shook it. It was late afternoon when they rode home. They didn't talk much. The kind of exhaustion that follows something that has cost a great deal doesn't generally prompt conversation. It prompts silence, the comfortable kind. The kind where two people who have been through something together don't need to narrate it to each other. Halfway home, Rhett reached across the wagon bench and took her hand. She let him. She held on, as a matter of fact, for the remaining 7 miles, watching the late November light fall across land that was no longer strange to her, that had, without her specific permission, become something she thought of as hers. Not because she'd been given it, because she'd fought for it, because she'd chosen it. They pulled up to the house and he helped her down, and this time she didn't step back. And he looked at her in the failing light with those quiet eyes that she had spent 3 months learning to read, and that she now understood as well as she understood anything in her life. "You stood up in there," he said. "Someone had to say it plainly. You didn't have to, I know." She looked up at him. "I wanted to." Something in his face that she didn't have a word for, and didn't need one. He put his hand against her face briefly, the rough, careful hand of a working man, and then let it drop, and they walked inside together into the lamplight and the warmth. And Mrs. Danforth had supper waiting and didn't ask any questions because she'd learned by now that this household communicated primarily in demonstrated facts rather than explanation. That night, after supper, after Mrs. Danforth had retired and the house was quiet, Elowen stood in the library doorway and looked at Rhett at his desk with his papers and his pen and the lamp throwing its circle of light around him. She thought about telling him then about the pregnancy. She had the words in her mouth. She held them a little longer. Not because she was afraid of his response, She had stopped being afraid of his responses some weeks ago, but because she was, for one private moment, alone with the fact of this life she was living, this life she had not chosen and had chosen anyway, this life that was growing in directions she hadn't drawn on any map she'd ever made for herself. She stood in the doorway and looked at him and felt the particular fullness of a person who has come through something hard and arrived somewhere unexpectedly real. Then she walked in, sat down across from him in her chair, and said, "There's something I need to tell you." He set his pen down, turned to face her with that full, careful attention. That was the thing she had first distrusted and come to value most. Outside, the valley was dark and cold, and the first true snow of the season was beginning to fall, quiet as a decision already made, settling across the burned fields and the running streams and the land that had, without anyone's permission or planning, become theirs. He didn't say anything for a long moment. She watched him absorb it, the news, the weight of it, the fact of it, and she didn't fill the silence, because she'd learned by now that his silences weren't absence. They were processing, and interrupting them produced worse outcomes than waiting them out. Then he said, "Are you well? Not are you sure? Not how did this happen with the particular masculine stupidity of a man who understands perfectly well how it happened. Not any of the dozen responses she'd half braced for. He asked if she was well, and he asked it with the direct, uncomplicated concern of a man whose first thought had gone to her rather than to himself. She felt something shift in her chest that she was not going to cry about. She was not a crier. She hadn't cried since her mother's funeral, and she wasn't going to start in a library over being asked a kind question. "I'm well," she said. "Mrs. Danforth knew before I did, which is humbling." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. She knows most things before most people. "I'm about 11 weeks along, I think." She kept her voice practical, because practical was what she was comfortable with. "The baby will come in late spring, early summer at the outside." He nodded slowly. He was looking at her with that full attention of his. The kind that she'd spent months learning wasn't surveillance. It was the way he made sure he was seeing something correctly before he responded to it. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. Not the physical question. The other one. She considered that for a moment. The honest answer, not the convenient one. "Surprised," she said, "and then not as surprised as I thought I should be." She looked at her hands in her lap. "And something else I don't have a precise word for. Not unhappy." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, very quietly, "I'm glad." 2 words. He didn't elaborate, didn't add anything to it, didn't construct a speech around it. Just those 2 words, and the way he said them with the plainness of something entirely true, told her more than a paragraph would have. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark and thought about the particular strange shape of her life, how it had arrived at this point through a sequence of events she would never have designed and couldn't have predicted, and how the place she'd arrived at was, she could admit it now, alone in the dark where the admission cost nothing, somewhere she recognized as right in the way that some things are simply right without requiring explanation or justification. She didn't know if that was contentment or love or just the plain relief of having survived a hard passage. She suspected it was all 3 braided together, which was probably what most real things were. The snow outside had stopped falling sometimes after midnight, and when she woke in the dark before dawn, the world outside her window was white and still, and the kind of quiet that means the land is resting. She let herself rest with it. For one morning, she had a feeling she was going to need the reserves. Crowder didn't disappear after the town meeting. She'd known he wouldn't. Men like Crowder didn't accept the loss of a single public confrontation as a definitive defeat. They retreated, regrouped, and came back through a different door. She'd been watching for the different door since they rode home in the snow, and she suspected Rhett had been watching too, though they discussed it only obliquely, both of them unwilling to spend their evenings in the new, tentative piece of their household chasing a threat that hadn't yet materialized into something concrete enough to fight. The materialization came in December, from a direction she hadn't fully anticipated. The county land office sent a notice. 3 separate claims had been filed against sections of Calder land, all 3 along the northern boundary, all three citing disputed survey records from the original territorial grants in the 1860s. The claims were filed by a land management company she'd never heard of. When she went to the library and pulled the relevant territorial records and spent 2 evenings tracing the company's registered owners through layers of legal paperwork, she found a name she recognized at the end of the chain. It wasn't Crowder directly. It was his brother-in-law, a man called Desmond Fitch, who operated from a town 50 miles east and had, according to the county business records she'd requested from their neighbor's most recent trip, filed similar claims against 4 other properties in the territory over the last 6 years. 3 of those properties had been subsequently acquired by Crowder at distressed prices. She put this in front of Rhett on a Tuesday evening with the same directness she'd put everything else in front of him. He read through it. He was quiet for a while. "The survey records they're citing," he said. "The 1,863 ones. I know." She'd looked at them already. They're legitimate. There's an ambiguity in the original boundary description on the northeast section, poorly worded, probably rushed, which was common in 1,863. It won't hold up to a proper resurvey, but a proper resurvey takes time and money, and while you're fighting it, the claims are on record, which makes the land difficult to use as collateral, which affects your operating credit for next season. He set the papers down and looked at her. "You worked all that out." "I spent 4 hours with the territorial land statutes." She shrugged. "It's not complicated once you know what you're looking at. The complication is that it takes time to counter, and time is what he wants." "What does he want the time for?" "I don't know yet." She pulled the paper with the Fitch Company information and the list of previously targeted properties. "But look at the pattern. In 2 of these 4 prior cases, the dispute period coincided with something happening to the property's main operations. One was a disease moving through the cattle. One was a fire." She paused. "In one case, both." He looked at the list. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was angry and was controlling it, a slight, almost invisible tightening. "He's planning something for while we're tied up in the legal dispute," Rhett said. "That's what I think. The winter range." He stood up. "Our main winter pasture is on the northeast section. If the cattle are on disputed land during the legal process, it complicates the livestock situation, yes." She folded her hands on the desk. "But I think it's the distraction as much as the legal outcome. He needs you focused on the county land office while something else is happening." "What else?" "I don't know yet," she said again, "but I want to find out before it finds us." The difficulty with trying to anticipate Crowder was that he operated through intermediaries, and those intermediaries were replaceable. He burned through people the way the fires burned through hay, using them and moving on before the damage could be traced back to the source. Rhett knew some of the names from years of paying attention, but Crowder had been careful enough that none of the connections were provable, and after the town meeting he would be even more careful. She started talking to the women. This was not a strategy she articulated out loud because she didn't think Rhett would have told her it was wrong, but she also knew it was something she could do more effectively without announcement. The women of Raven Hollow were a different information network than the men they moved through different spaces, heard different things, noticed different details, and were accustomed to being underestimated by the people they were gathering information from. She called on Mrs. Pruitt under the auspices of discussing the community response to the burned hay, a perfectly legitimate reason for a neighborly visit, and came away 3 hours later with several things she hadn't had going in. Ed Pruitt had been approached by a man she didn't recognize 2 days before the fires, offering to buy the lease land at what had seemed like a decent price. Ed had said no. 2 days later, the hay burned. That sequence had not made it into Ed's public account at the town meeting, either because he hadn't connected it or because he'd been embarrassed by it, or both. She visited the Aldridges the following week. Similar story, an approach before the fire, an offer, a refusal, then the fire. They had also not mentioned it publicly. People didn't talk about being targeted because being targeted felt shameful, like an admission that you were weak enough to be worth targeting. She understood that impulse, and she also understood that it was exactly what Crowder was counting on. She wrote down everything, and she kept writing. In January, two things happened within 3 days of each other that told her the timeline had accelerated. The first was that Rhett came home from a ride along the northern fence and told her, in the flat voice he used when he was managing information carefully before deciding what to do with it, that he'd found evidence of recent activity near the winter pasture tracks, the residue of a fire that had been started and then abandoned, possibly because someone had seen him coming, possibly because the timing wasn't right. The second was that her father arrived. He came in on a Wednesday afternoon on a horse that was too thin for the weather, wearing a coat that was not warm enough for January in Colorado. And he sat in the kitchen and held his coffee cup with both hands and didn't look at her directly for the first 15 minutes. She sat across from him and waited, because she'd learned patience from the people she lived with now, and also but some conversations needed time to find their footing before anything real could be said. "I heard about the town meeting," he said finally. "Word travels. People are saying things about you." He looked up. "Good things. About how you spoke." She didn't respond to that directly. "You look like you haven't been eating enough, Papa." He looked back at the coffee. "The ranches, it's difficult." Without he stopped. Started again. "I'm not managing as well as I should be." This was Walter Hartley's version of saying, "I made a terrible mistake and I miss my daughter and I don't know how to say any of that." She understood his language. She'd grown up in it. "You're staying for supper," she said, "and possibly several days. We'll discuss the rest after you've slept in a warm room." He looked at her with the particular expression of a parent confronting a child who has outgrown the parent's capacity to protect them and is now being gentle about it, which is one of the stranger experiences a parent can have and one of the more complicated ones for the child. "Ellie," he set the cup down, "I sold you to clear a debt, and I've been carrying that since October, and I need to say it out loud before I can say anything else. I sold my daughter to a man with a frightening name because I was drowning, and I couldn't see any other way, and his voice broke cleanly, the way dry wood breaks. I'm sorry. I don't have anything that makes it better. I'm sorry." She looked at her father. At this man who had held her hand at her mother's funeral and taught her to ride and worked himself thin over 3 bad years, trying to keep a piece of land that had been his father's, and who had, in the extremity of desperation, made a decision she hadn't forgiven him for and had been quietly forgiving him for since November. "I know," she said. "You're not going to make this easy," he said, with something that was almost his old humor. "Making things easy isn't generally my approach." She reached across and covered his hand with hers. "I'm not going to tell you it was all right, because it wasn't. And I'm not going to tell you everything I found here has been simple or easy or what I wanted." She paused. "But I'll tell you that I'm not unhappy. And I'll tell you that the man you sold me to turned out to be considerably more complicated than the stories suggested." "I heard that too." He looked at her hand covering his. "He's a good man?" She thought about everything she'd learned over 4 months, the water ledger, Fetch's history, Pete Calloway's wages, the locked box of thank you letters, 2 days of building an evidence file that could have gone wrong in a dozen ways, Rhett standing in a community hall telling the truth in front of 100 people it cost him to face. "He's a real man," she said, which is better than good. Rhett came in from the afternoon work and met Walter Hartley in the kitchen, and the exchange between the two men was brief and careful, and contained about 14 different things, neither of them said out loud, which was, Elowen thought, probably the most honest conversation they were capable of having at this stage. Rhett shook her father's hand. He said Walter was welcome to stay as long as he needed. He said it without performance, the way he said most things, and Walter received it with the awkward gratitude of a man who had expected to be made to suffer for his choices and was finding the absence of that suffering almost harder to accept. Walter Hartley stayed a week. During that week, while Elowen was managing a household, tracking Crowder's probable next move, and quietly being pregnant in the way of women who don't have the option of making it the main subject of their lives, also watched her father find his bearings around the ranch. He was not a man who sat still well. He'd been a rancher his whole life. Within 2 days, he was helping Pete Calloway with light fence work. Pete's arm had healed well, but he was still slower than he'd been, and by the 4th day he was having a long conversation with Fetch about the north pasture rotation in the particular engaged shorthand of 2 experienced men talking about land they understood. On the 6th day, Rhett came to find her in the library. He stood in the doorway with that careful look he got when he was about to say something he'd thought through. "Your father," he said. "I know, she'd seen it too. He's good with the cattle. He's been ranching for 30 years. I've been thinking about the east property." He came into the room, sat down. "The grazing land I acquired last spring. I haven't had anyone managing it properly because I've been stretched thin on the main operation. It needs someone with enough experience to run it independently." He paused. "I could offer him a partnership, real partnership, not charity. He'd earn his share." She looked at him. "Have you thought about how it would look? People will say you're keeping him close because you own him. People have been saying things about me for 15 years. He held her gaze. "What do you think?" She thought about her father on the porch talking to Fetch. She thought about what it meant to give a man back a version of his dignity that he'd lost not through weakness exactly, but through the kind of desperation that can turn even a good person toward choices they can't undo. "Think you should ask him," she said, "and I think you should make it real. He'll know the difference." Rhett asked him next morning. Walter said yes before Rhett finished explaining the terms, then apparently embarrassed himself by saying yes too fast, and had to spend several minutes pretending to think about it more carefully. Rhett allowed him the fiction of reconsidering, and then accepted his yes again, which was, Elowen thought, one of the more quietly decent things she'd watched Rhett do, and the list was not short. Walter Hartley left the following day to start arranging the move to the east property, and Elowen stood in the cold January morning and watched him ride out with something that had been knotted in her chest since October loosening, not all at once, but enough to notice. Crisis, when it came fast. She'd been expecting something, but she hadn't been able to pin down the when or the how, and Crowder had apparently been patient enough to wait out the worst of the winter before moving patient and calculating in the particular way of a man who was running out of options and knew it, and was therefore more dangerous, not less. It was the last week of January. The temperature had dropped hard, genuine deep winter cold that made the horses reluctant, and the ground iron, and every outdoor task take twice as long. Rhett had ridden out early with Fetch and 2 other hands to check the northern water sources, which could freeze in these temperatures and needed monitoring. She was in the office with the accounts when young Cody came in at a run and stopped in the doorway with his face the particular color of a person who has been outside in serious cold and also running. "Fire," he said. "North of the winter range, big one." She was already standing. "How far?" 3, maybe 4 miles. "Winds from the west," he swallowed. "Winds pushing it toward the winter range. West wind pushing a fire east, toward the main winter pasture where several hundred cattle were currently sheltering. In January, in this cold, those cattle were the operational core of the ranch. Their calving season was months away. They were pregnant and vulnerable. And if they had to be moved in this temperature, there would be losses. Pasture burned and they couldn't be moved in time, the losses would be catastrophic. She thought for approximately 4 seconds. "Where's Rhett?" she asked. "North water sources. Too far to get there fast. Who's on property right now?" Cody counted. "Me, Pete," 2 of the seasonal men. Pete Calloway with a healed but not fully reliable arm. Cody, 17, 2 seasonal hands she knew by name and capability. And herself, 5 months pregnant, which she acknowledged as a relevant factor and then set it to one side because it was a factor among several and not the deciding one. "Get Pete," she said. "Tell him I need him at the barn in 2 minutes." She was at the barn in 90 seconds, pulling on her heavy coat, running the situation in her head with the particular mental clarity that comes, sometimes, when there's no room for anything except the problem. The fire was moving east. The cattle in the winter range needed to be moved, but moving several hundred cattle in this cold required more riders than she currently had, and in the time it would take to reach Rhett, the fire would be significantly closer. She needed a fire break. She needed it faster than she could build one by conventional means. She thought about Rhett's irrigation records. 11 years of water data, every channel and distribution point mapped and noted. She'd read those records 3 times in the library, not because she'd been planning for this, but because they were interesting, and because understanding the land's water system was part of understanding the land. She knew where the main channel fed into the Winter Range's eastern boundary. She knew where the distribution sluices were. She went to the barn wall where the property maps were tacked up. Rhett kept updated maps at multiple points on the property, another habit she'd thought was excessive until right now, and put her finger on the irrigation network's junction points. Pete appeared in the barn doorway. He looked at her at the map and didn't say anything, which she had come to appreciate about Pete Calloway. "Fire's coming from the northwest," she said. "If we open the main sluice at Junction 4 and redirect through the secondary channel to the south boundary, we can flood the lower pasture and create a wet break before the fire reaches the Winter Range." Pete looked at the map. He was a man who thought before he spoke, which took a moment. "That's the best lower pasture," he said. "Fluting it in this cold does real damage. I know. We'd lose the grass. The ground would be waterlogged and then frozen. Could be out of use for a season. I know, Pete." She met his eyes. "What's a season of lower pasture against the Winter Range and the cattle in it?" He looked at the map for one more moment. Junction 4 is about 2 miles out. "Ice on the sluice mechanism. Can you break it? With enough time and a heavy wrench? Yes. You've got 40 minutes before the fire reaches the eastern boundary," she said. Based on the wind speed and what Cody described, she'd been calculating since Cody walked in the door, and she was reasonably confident in the number. 40 minutes enough? Pete didn't hesitate long. "I'll need Cody and the 2 seasonals. Take them." She was already moving. "I'll get the cattle moving out of the north end of the range in case the break doesn't hold. Give me a signal when the sluice opens. You shouldn't be out there," Pete said. Not an argument. Just a statement of fact from a man who knew she was pregnant because his wife had told him 2 months ago, and ranch families didn't keep secrets well. "I know," she said. "Open the sluice, Pete." He went. She took the steadiest horse in the barn, a big gray quarter horse named Anchor, who had the particular quality of being entirely unmoved by things that upset other horses, and she rode toward the north end of the Winter Range. The smoke was visible now, a dirty smear across the January sky to the northwest, dark at its base and spreading as the wind took it. The cold air made it worse, no moisture in anything. Every piece of dry winter grass, a potential fuel, and she could feel the wind at her back, steady and committed in the way that bad weather is steady and committed when it has made up its mind. The cattle knew before she got there. They were already moving restlessly at the northern end of the range, pushing against the fence line, the kind of collective animal anxiety that precedes disaster, the way tremors precede a collapse. She opened the north gate and went around the outside of the herd with Anchor, using the horse's steady presence and her own movements to push the animals through, not stampeding them, which would cost lives in this cold, but moving them purposefully, the way you move cattle when you know what you're doing and you don't have time to do it incorrectly. It was hard work. It was the hardest physical work she'd done since coming to the Calder Ranch, and she was aware of her body in ways she was trying not to be too aware of the cold and the smoke smell getting stronger and the ground iron hard under Anchor's hooves. Kept moving. The cattle moved. Slowly. Too slowly, she thought. She heard the water before she saw it. The sound of a released sluice in winter is distinctive, the initial crack of breaking ice, and then the deep rushing surge of water that has been held back finding its path. And the ground along the lower pasture's south edge began to darken as the water spread across it in a thin rushing sheet, immediately beginning to ice at its edges in the cold, but reaching far enough to wet the grass, to break the fuel continuity that a fire needs to keep running. Pete had made it in 38 minutes. She pushed the last of the cattle through the north gate and latched it with hands that were numb inside her gloves and turned to look at the fire's advance. It reached the lower pasture boundary and slowed. She could see it from where she sat on Anchor, at the north gate, the fire eating through the dry grass at the boundary's edge, and then hitting the wet ground and losing its footing, dying back in sections. finding the edges where dry grass still met the fire front and moving there instead, losing coherence and momentum as the wet break interrupted its path. It didn't stop immediately, fires don't stop on cue. But it slowed, and slowing was enough the direction changed. Pulling south and east away from the winter range, away from the cattle now bunched against the fence line in the next pasture over, toward open ground where it would burn itself out against the natural firebreak of the frozen creek bed half a mile east. She sat on anchor in the cold and watched it go, and felt something leave her body that she hadn't realized she'd been holding every muscle she owned, apparently all of them simultaneously. Rhett found her there. He'd seen the smoke from the water sources and ridden hard, and he came through the north gate at speed and pulled up when he saw her on anchor at the fence line. And she watched him take in the scene, the fire moving away. The flooded lower pasture already starting to ice, the cattle safe in the adjacent field, and then he looked at her. "The sluice," he said. "You opened the sluice." Pete opened it. I told Pete to open it. He looked at the lower pasture, his best lower pasture, the winter grass he'd planned for, now underwater and icing over in January. "We'll lose that ground," he said, "for a season. Maybe two." She met his eyes. "The winter range is intact. The cattle are safe." He was quiet for a moment. He had snow on his coat from the hard ride, and his jaw was red with cold, and he was looking at her the way he'd looked at her across a kitchen table in October, with the expression of a man who is adjusting his. Understanding of something he thought he'd already understood. "You were out here," he said, "moving cattle. Someone had to. You're 5 months pregnant, Elowen. I'm aware." She kept her voice level. "The cattle needed moving, and I was the person available." I was careful. He said the word with the particular flatness of a man who would like to say several other things and is deciding against it. "I didn't do anything stupid," she said. "I used the irrigation network, and I pushed cattle through a gate. I didn't fight the fire." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the smoking lower pasture and the intact winter range and the cattle moving quietly in the adjacent field. He was doing the math, what had been lost against what had been saved, and what the alternative would have looked like if she'd stayed in the house. "I know," he said finally. "I know you didn't." He ran a hand over his face. "I'm not angry." "You're scared," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, I'm all right," she said it directly, without softening it into a comfort. "The baby is all right. I was careful and I knew what I was doing, and everything is all right." He nodded slowly. He brought his horse alongside anchor and reached across and put his hand on her arm for a moment, the rough, brief contact of a man who feels things strongly and expresses them proportionally, and then straightened. "Let's go home," he said. She was almost ready to follow him when Cody came riding at a hard gallop from the south, waving his arm, and she felt the small piece of the last 5 minutes contract back into something harder. "Mr. Calder," Cody called, pulling up. "We caught 2 men at the south boundary. They had oil cans, Fetch is holding them." She looked at Rhett. Rhett's face had gone very still, the stillness of a man who had confirmed what he'd suspected for months and is now deciding what the confirmation requires of him. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Don't do anything that proves what they've been saying about you," she said quietly. Not a warning exactly, more like a reminder of what he'd chosen in that community hall in November, and what it had cost him and what it had built. His jaw worked for a moment. "I know," he said. They rode south together, toward the boundary, toward whatever was waiting there, toward the end of something that had been a long time unraveling. The 2 men Fetch was holding were young mid-20s, hired hands by the look of them, the kind of men who take work that pays without asking enough questions about who's paying and why. They were scared, which was appropriate. Fetch had them against the fence with a calm authority that didn't require volume or threat, and the oil cans were on the ground between them, evidence that required no interpretation. Rhett looked at the men, at the cans, at the ground where they'd apparently been preparing to set a second fire, while the first one drew attention to the north. He turned to Cody. "Ride to town. Get Sheriff Halverson." He looked at the young men again. "Tell him to bring something to write with." He didn't touch the men. He didn't threaten them. He stood there with his arms folded and waited, which was in its own way more frightening than anything the Black Wolf would have done, and the two young men seemed to understand this because they didn't try anything. When Halverson arrived 2 hours later, the men talked quickly. Men with oil cans and no good explanation who are already caught don't generally require much encouragement to produce names, and the name they produced was the one she'd expected. Silas Crowder. Halverson wrote it down. She stood in the cold with her husband beside her and watched the sheriff write the name into his record book, and she thought about October and the kitchen table and the flour sack she'd dropped on the floor, and she thought about what she'd believed she was walking into and what she'd actually found, and she thought about all the things that had to go exactly wrong to produce a life that was turning out, unexpectedly and without her permission, to be the truest one she'd ever imagined for herself. Rhett's hand found hers in the cold. She held on. Halverson looked up from his notebook. "I'll need statements from both of you," he said, "and anything you have on Crowder's prior activities." "She has everything," Rhett said. He glanced at her. "She's been building the file for 2 months." Halverson looked at her with the slight recalibration that men made when presented with a woman who had done something they hadn't expected. "Mrs. Calder," he said. "I'll have it ready by morning," she said. She did. The file she delivered to Sheriff Halverson the next morning was 43 pages. She had been up before dawn assembling it not because she couldn't sleep, though sleep had been difficult, but because she wanted it complete and she wanted it correct, and she was constitutionally incapable of doing something halfway when the whole version was available to her. Rhett had found her at the desk at 2 a.m. and brought her coffee without comment, and sat in the chair across from her, reading through sections she'd finished while she worked on the next ones, occasionally adding a note in his own handwriting when something needed clarification that only he could provide. They hadn't talked much. They hadn't needed to. It was the same quality of shared silence she'd first noticed in that kitchen on her second morning at the ranch, the kind that exists between people who have arrived, without negotiating it, at a common purpose. The file contained the land transaction records she'd traced through Fitch's company back to Crowder. It contained the timeline of fires and financial disruptions and the subsequent distressed price land sales. It contained the statement she'd gathered from Mrs. Pruitt and the Aldridges about the pre-fire purchase approaches. It contained Garrett's public retraction from the town meeting, written up formally and signed. It contained the paid account records from the county medical office showing Crowder's brother-in-law as the registered agent on 3 of the suspicious land filings. And it contained, with the relevant family's permission she'd sought by letter over the preceding weeks, brief statements from Clara Tillman and the Garrett family, and 2 others describing assistance they'd received quietly from the Calder Ranch during periods when the public story had been attributing their difficulties to Calder's malice. She handed it to Halverson across his desk at 8 a.m. He looked at the size of it. He looked at her. "You put this together yourself?" he asked. "My husband contributed documentation," she said. "The analysis and the organization are mine." Halverson was a careful man, that was his reputation, and it had turned out to be accurate. He spent the next hour going through the file while she sat across from him and answered questions, and she watched him move from professional neutrality to something she could only describe as a man who has been given a problem he'd thought was unsolvable and is discovering that someone else had already solved it. "The 2 men we're holding," he said, "their statements name Crowder directly. Yes, he'll say they're lying. He'll say they were freelancing. That's why the pattern matters," she said. "1 pair of men with oil cans could be freelancing. This," she gestured at the file, "is not freelancing. This is a decade of coordinated activity with a consistent beneficiary." Halverson looked at the file for a moment. "You understand this won't resolve quickly." "Legal processes in the territory, I understand." She had no illusions about speed. She'd grown up watching how slowly justice moved in places where it had to travel over difficult terrain. "I'm not asking for quick. I'm asking for thorough." He nodded. He closed the file. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is recalibrating something, and she recognized the expression because she'd seen it before on Mrs. Danforth's face that first morning in the kitchen, on Fetch's face the first time she'd asked him a real question about ranch history, on Ed Pruitt's face in the community hall when Clara Tillman stood up and started talking. The expression of someone being asked to update what they think they know. "I'll be in touch," Halverson said. Crowder was served notice of investigation 3 days later. She heard about it from Mrs. Danforth, who had a network of information sources that operated at a speed and precision that Elowen had come to respect deeply. By the end of that same week, word had moved through Raven Hollow in the particular way that significant news moves through small communities not all at once, but in waves, each wave carrying more detail and less distortion than the last, till the general shape of what had happened was reasonably clear to most people who paid attention. The reaction was not simple. It never was. Some people were relieved. Some people were angry not at Crowder, or not only at Crowder, but at themselves for having believed the easier story for so long. And that kind of anger is uncomfortable and tends to get redirected. There were people in Raven Hollow who had told the Garrett story, and the Tillman story, and the Morrison story, with confidence and conviction, who now had to live with having been wrong, and living with being wrong is harder for some people than the original mistake. A few of them directed that discomfort at Elowen, which she found somewhat unreasonable and also entirely predictable. She was the outsider who had come in and rearranged the furniture of the valley's understanding of itself, and even when the rearrangement was correct, the people who'd known where everything was before didn't always thank you for moving it. She dealt with this the way she dealt with most things that irritated her. She noted it, filed it, and got on with what she was doing. What she was doing, increasingly, was the cooperative water system. The idea had been in the back of her mind since the town meeting, when she'd seen the way the valley's ranchers responded to Rhett's water records with genuine interest, the kind that comes when people realize someone has been tracking something they themselves depended on and hadn't thought to document. She'd mentioned it to Rhett in February, and he'd looked at the ceiling for a while and said, "Go on," and she'd gone on. The concept was straightforward in the way that the best ideas usually are, a formal cooperative agreement among the valley's ranchers governing access to the main water channels and streams during drought periods, with Rhett's 11 years of tracking data as the foundation for equitable distribution formulas. No single ranch would control access. Emergency protocols would govern shared response to drought conditions. The smaller operations, the Aldridges, the Pruitts, the leaseholders along the north boundary would have guaranteed minimum access even in the worst years. It would mean Rhett giving up exclusive control of channels he'd spent years and considerable money developing. She'd known this when she proposed it. She'd proposed it anyway. "You're asking me to share the irrigation system," he'd said. "I'm asking you to make it so. The valley has a reason to protect the system," she'd said. "Right now it belongs to you. If something happened to you, or if the politics shifted, the smaller ranchers have no claim on it. Make them co-owners of the outcome, and you've changed what they're defending." He'd thought about it for 2 days. She didn't push. She'd learned by now that pushing Rhett Calder toward a decision before he'd finished thinking it through produced resistance, not agreement, and she had no interest in winning arguments. She had interest in changing actual outcomes. On the 3rd day, he'd said, "Draft the terms." She drafted them over the next 2 weeks, consulting with Rhett on the technical parameters and with Fetch on the historical patterns. And she'd sent a preliminary copy to Hartle on the Valley Council before she sent it to anyone else. Because getting the council's structural support before the general conversation would make the conversation significantly more productive. Hartle had responded within a week. He was interested. He had questions. She answered the questions. By March, the draft was circulating among the valley's 11 working ranches. By April, 8 of them had signed a letter of intent. Ed Pruitt was the 9th, in the first week of May, and he'd brought his wife with him to the Calder Ranch to sign it, which told Elowen that his wife had been the deciding factor, and she filed that away as information worth having. The remaining 2 ranches were Calder and a small operation run by a family called the Westons, who were new to the valley and not yet sure whose side anything was on. Rhett signed his copy in the library on an evening in early May with the careful signature of a man who understands that some things, once done, don't come undone. She signed as co-owner alongside him, which had required a quiet legal conversation in February to ensure that the marriage arrangement had produced the actual shared property rights she'd assumed it would, but hadn't verified until it occurred to her that she should verify it. It had. Rhett had made it so from the beginning, which she'd discovered without him mentioning it. The Weston family signed a month later, after their first summer on the cooperative water schedule had shown them what having a guaranteed allocation actually meant for their small operations' stability. None of this resolved quickly or cleanly. The cooperative agreement had arguments and misunderstandings, and one serious dispute in its first summer over whether the Aldridge allocation formula counted correctly for their expanded herd. And that dispute required 3 meetings and one very uncomfortable afternoon, with Elowen mediating between Ed Pruitt and old Jacob Aldridge, both of whom had strong feelings they were not shy about expressing. She was 6 months pregnant during that afternoon, and she sat between those two men and held the line of the argument firmly and didn't let it become personal, and by the end of it they had a revised formula and a grudging mutual respect, and she had a headache she carried home and didn't mention. Rhett had asked that evening how it had gone. "Fine," she'd said. "You have your headache face," he said. She'd looked at him. "I have a headache face?" "Yes." He said it with the equanimity of a man who has been paying attention for 7 months and isn't embarrassed about it. "You've had it 3 times. Once when the supply order came in wrong in February, once when Cody broke the fence brace for the 2nd time in a month, and now." She'd stared at him for a moment and then laughed, genuinely laughed, the kind that comes without announcement, and the headache had not gone away, but had become less important, which was as much as she generally asked of things. Her son was born on a Thursday in late June. She had not asked for it to be easy, and it wasn't. It was 14 hours of labor that she endured with the same focused stubbornness she brought to everything, and Mrs. Danforth stayed through all of it, and the doctor from town arrived just before the final hours, and Rhett sat outside the bedroom door for most of the night in a way that Mrs. Danforth told her about afterward that he'd sat there not pacing, not demanding information, just present. In that particular way he had of being present that she'd spent months learning to read as care rather than pressure. The baby was healthy. She was tired in a way that went all the way to the middle of her bones. She held her son and looked at him, this entirely new person who had no relationship yet to any of the complicated, costly things that had produced him, and felt something she didn't have a word for and suspected didn't need one. Rhett came in when Mrs. Danforth went out. He sat beside her and looked at his son with the expression of a man who has spent most of his life being careful not to want things too much, confronting something he'd apparently wanted more than he'd admitted to himself. "He has your nose," Elowen said. Poor boy. It came out with a dryness that made her smile. "It's a good nose." She looked at him. "He should have a name." I thought he stopped. Started again. He was not a man who stumbled on words often, and when he did it usually meant something. "I'd like to name him Thomas, if you agree, after my father." She hadn't known his father's name. There were still things she didn't know about him, which she'd come to accept was simply the nature of knowing another person. It wasn't a destination you arrived at. It was a direction you kept moving in. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." Thomas Calder was 3 weeks old when Crowder's legal situation resolved sufficiently to become public knowledge. The territory's process had, as she'd predicted to Halverson, not been quick. It had ground along through spring and into summer, through depositions and legal filings and the particular tedious machinery of justice, trying to catch up with events that had been moving faster than it could track for years. The 2 men with the oil cans had testified. 3 more of Crowder's former associates had come forward once it became clear that the legal weight was shifting, who had been waiting to see which way the wind was going before committing to a direction, which was human and pragmatic and not particularly admirable but useful under the circumstances. Fitch's Land Company had been formally tied to Crowder through a succession of property records that the county assessor had spent 2 months untangling. The pattern she'd documented, the approaches, the fires, the distressed sales, was now part of the official record of the investigation. Crowder did not go quietly. He'd hired the best legal representation available in the territory, which was not exceptional, and he'd spent the spring attempting to discredit the evidence through technical objections and personal attacks on the credibility of witnesses. The personal attacks had included some commentary on Elowen's position as an interested party, which she'd heard about secondhand and found mildly amusing, given that everything she'd put in that 43-page file was verifiable public record. He'd also attempted, in February, to purchase the cooperation of one of the Valley ranchers who'd signed the water cooperative letter, offering considerably more than market value for their property in what appeared to be a last attempt to destabilize the coalition she'd built. The rancher, it was Jacob Aldridge, which surprised no one who knew Jacob Aldridge's lifelong relationship with money, had taken the offer to Rhett rather than Crowder, which had resulted in another filing with Halverson and another entry in the formal record. In the end, Crowder's holdings were seized under territory fraud statutes that covered land acquisition through deliberate misrepresentation and coordinated interference with property rights. He retained his personal property and a reduced business operation that no longer included the land along the valley's main water corridor. He left Raven Hollow in September, and the manner of his leaving quietly, in the early morning, without announcement, was such a contrast to his decade and a half of visible, confident presence in the valley that several people who witnessed it remarked that they almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The land he'd acquired through distressed sales went back through the legal process. Some of it was returned to original families at the forced sale prices corrected for current value, which Crowder's frozen assets funded. Some of it was sold at proper market rates, and the proceeds handled by a county administrator. The Aldridges recovered the lease land they'd been operating. The Pruitts recovered their eastern field. It was not perfectly tidy, these things never were, but it was substantially better than anyone had expected it to be in October, when the investigation was barely started. In November, almost exactly a year after the town meeting where everything had turned, Raven Hollow held another community assembly. This one was not called in crisis. Hartle had organized it specifically to ratify the formal charter of the Valley Water Cooperative, which required a 2/3 majority of the participating ranches to make it binding as a legal document rather than a series of letters of intent. All 11 ranches voted yes. She stood in the same community hall where she'd watched Rhett put his account books on the council table 12 months ago, and she watched the charter signed, and she thought about all the things that had to happen in a specific sequence to produce this moment: the drought that had broken her father's ranch, the debt that had forced his choice, the marriage she'd walked into like someone walking into a room with uncertain floors, and everything that had come after. She thought about the woman she'd been in that kitchen in October 1876, holding a dish towel she'd forgotten she was holding, watching her father's hand shake over a paper that would change her life. That woman had not known what she was capable of. She'd known she was capable of surviving, which was not the same thing. Surviving is something you do to yourself. Building something is something you do with other people, and you can't do it until you've found people worth building with. She hadn't chosen Rhett Calder. She hadn't chosen this valley, or this ranch, or this particular set of problems. She hadn't chosen any of the conditions that had produced her life. What she'd chosen was what she did with them. That distinction, she'd come to understand, was everything. The assembly dinner that followed the ratification was the most genuinely social Elowen had been in the 14 months since she'd arrived in Raven Hollow. The hall was warm with people who had come through something together and were cautiously glad to still be on the other side of it, and there was food and noise and children running between the adults' legs. And Thomas, now 5 months old and opinionated about everything, was passed between women who cooed at him and men who held him at arm's length, with the particular discomfort of people who don't yet know how. And he endured it with the philosophical tolerance of a baby who has already established that his primary needs will be met. Ed Pruitt found her near the end of the evening. He was a man who didn't produce small talk easily, so when he stopped in front of her with his hat in his hands, she expected something real. "What you did," he said, with the file, "the evidence, the water agreement." He stopped. I owe you a different accounting than I gave you last November. She looked at him steadily. You told the truth about what you saw. I told part of it. He met her eyes. I left out the part about the man who came to buy my land before the fire. I left it out because it made me look like I'd been played for a fool, and I didn't want. He stopped. I should have told the whole truth. You told it eventually, she said. Halverson had to ask me twice. He told it eventually is what matters. She paused. You also brought your wife when you signed the cooperative charter. He looked slightly confused by the connection. She'd had the whole story from your wife since February, Elowen said. Your wife knew about the man who approached you before the fire. She'd been waiting for you to say it out loud. She kept her tone neutral. You both got there. That's what matters. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. He was, she suspected, revising several things at once. He put his hat on his head and nodded once. Good evening, Mrs. Calder, good evening, Mr. Pruitt. She found Rhett at the edge of the room, where he generally positioned himself at gatherings, close enough to be present, far enough to have room. He had Thomas, who had fallen asleep against his father's shoulder with the absolute confidence of someone who has determined this is the safest place available and is done debating it. She stood beside him and looked out at the hall full of people. Pruitt apologized, she said. I noticed. How'd you respond? Reasonably. He glanced at her with something that had become, over 14 months, a fully developed version of that near smile she'd first noticed in the library. You were probably more generous than he deserved. Maybe. He's going to be a cooperative member for the next 30 years. It's worth the investment. He made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she ever got from him in public, which was enough. Thomas shifted on his shoulder, made a sound, resettled. He's heavier than he looks, Rhett said. He's 5 months old and you've been holding him for 2 hours. I know, he didn't move to put the baby down. She looked at them, her husband and her son, in the warm light of a room full of people who had mostly stopped being afraid of one name and hadn't yet found another to replace it with, and she thought about names and reputations in the distance. Between the story a place tells about a person and the actual person standing inside that story trying to be real. The Black Wolf of Raven Hollow. She hadn't heard that name in weeks. She'd been keeping informal track, the way you track the fading of something you want to make sure is actually fading and not just retreating temporarily. The last time she'd heard it used without irony was in August, from a child who'd heard it from a parent who'd probably used it as a shorthand for something they no longer fully believed. Children inherit the stories before they inherit the revisions, which was one of the minor tragedies of how knowledge traveled. She thought the name would probably not disappear entirely. Names like that didn't, in a valley that had been using it for 15 years. But it had changed texture. It was becoming historical rather than current, something the valley had believed rather than something the valley still believed. And that was the version of gone she was prepared to accept. A year later, Thomas walking now, unsteady and determined, crashing into furniture and people with the magnificent indifference of someone who has not yet learned to be embarrassed. Her father came for the planting season and stayed through summer. Walter Hartley had changed. Not completely, he was still the man who'd made the choice. She hadn't forgiven him for cleanly or quickly, but he'd changed in the way of people who've had to start a chapter of their life later than they'd planned and discovered that starting. Over, however humbling, produces a version of themselves that's more honest than the one that preceded it. He managed the East property with the seriousness of a man who understands he's been given something he doesn't fully deserve and intends to prove that he can. He was good at it. The cattle on that land were healthier by summer's end than they'd been when he arrived in spring, which Rhett noted in his quarterly accounts without particular comment, and which Walter noticed Rhett noting, and the two men's relationship had settled into something she hadn't predicted, when it started a mutual, guarded respect that occasionally produced actual conversation. One evening in July, she came around the side of the barn and found them talking. Not about cattle, about water, the stream levels that summer, the pattern in Rhett's records. Her father was pointing at something in the sky, some cloud formation, and Rhett was listening. She stood where she was, out of their sight line, and watched for a moment. Her father had spent a lifetime knowing things about land and weather that he'd never had anyone of equal knowledge to discuss them with. Rhett had spent 15 years observing a valley from behind a reputation that kept people at a distance. She watched them stand there and talk about clouds above the East Ridge and felt something settle in her chest with a finality that had been building toward that moment for a long time. She walked around the other side of the barn and left them to it. By Thomas's second birthday, the cooperative water system had its first real test, a dry August that would have, under the old arrangement, produced the predictable conflict over access between the larger and smaller operations. Instead, it produced a series of structured allocation adjustments, worked out in 2 meetings, that left everyone short of what they wanted, and nobody catastrophically damaged. The Aldridges, who would have lost a third of their hay under the old system, lost 6%. Ed Pruitt grumbled about his adjusted allocation, but signed the paperwork. The Westons, in their second year on the cooperative, said nothing publicly but sent a jar of honey to the Calder Ranch with a note that said simply, "Thank you for the sensible arrangement." She put the note in the locked box with the other letters. It seemed right. Cody, who had turned 19 and grown 4 inches and stopped turning red every time she spoke to him, started courting a girl from the Weston family in the fall of that year. He came to Rhett to ask, formally, whether it was all right, whether it would cause any awkwardness, given the Westons were cooperative partners and relatively new to the valley. Rhett told him that was the most unnecessary question he'd been asked in 20 years, and to go ahead. Cody went ahead. Pete Calloway's wife had her 4th child in October. Pete's arm had healed well enough that he'd been doing full work since spring, and he'd been given a section of fence line to manage independently, a small thing, structurally, but the kind of thing that told a man where he stood. He managed it with the careful competence of someone who understood what it meant that he'd been given it. Fetch turned 73 and showed no signs of slowing, except that he'd started letting Cody carry the heavy end of things without commenting on it, which was the closest thing to concession his nature was capable of producing. Mrs. Danforth taught Elowen to make a specific pie crust in the second winter, the one she'd been quietly failing to replicate since her first month at the ranch. The lesson took 3 afternoons and involved more correction than encouragement, which Elowen appreciated because she had no patience for instruction that couldn't tell her directly what she was doing wrong. The pie crust remained imperfect. Mrs. Danforth said this was because Elowen worked it too hard, that she had the habit of pushing through when she should stop, which was useful in most circumstances and fatal to pastry. Elowen thought about that more than the pie crust probably warranted. 2 daughters came in the years after Thomas, the first one in March, when he was 3, the second 18 months later, which was a shorter interval than she'd planned for, and required a period of adjustment she didn't fully describe to anyone. The second pregnancy was harder than the first, and the first had not been easy, and she moved through both of them with the same combination of stubbornness and pragmatism that she brought to everything, which worked imperfectly but well enough. Rhett, with each child, became visibly more competent and visibly more unnerved, which she found endearing in the particular way that competent people's uncertainty about specific things is endearing. He was fine when the children were sick, steady, practical, the same quality of present he brought to crises generally. He was less fine when they cried without apparent reason, which babies did constantly, and which appeared to activate in him the same helpless frustration that problems without identifiable solutions always did. She let him be helpless about it because she couldn't actually solve it for him, and because there was something honest nat about watching a man who controlled considerable amounts of land and cattle and machinery sit in a rocking chair at 2 in the morning, completely defeated by a 6-week-old who simply preferred to be awake. "She'll sleep eventually," Elowen told him once from the doorway. "When?" he asked. "Within the decade, probably." He looked at her over the baby's head with an expression that was so thoroughly unguarded that she had to look away before she said something she would express badly. The valley changed, and the valley stayed the same, the way places do when they contain both enough history and enough future to be genuinely complex. There were 2 bad winters and 1 excellent summer, And one summer of cattle illness that moved through the cooperative ranches and required a coordinated response that stressed the new system but didn't break it. There were arguments in cooperative meetings that lasted longer than they should have and got resolved by someone with enough sense to force the practical question. There were children who went to school together in the schoolhouse that Hartle's wife had organized and that the cooperative had collectively funded, including Calder money, including a library corner that Elowen had insisted on, and that contained 34 books, which was 34 more than the school had previously owned. Raven Hollow was not a transformed place. It was a somewhat better place, which was the only kind of transformation that actually held. On a summer evening, when Thomas was 4 and his sisters were 1 and nearly 3, and the light was doing that particular Colorado thing, where it seems to come from everywhere at once and make the grass look like it means something, Elowen sat with Rhett on the porch of the house that had become, without announcement, without ceremony, by the accumulation of ordinary days hers. The children were in the grass below. Thomas was attempting to teach his older sister to catch a ball, which was not going well for either of them. The younger one was sitting in the grass, eating it thoughtfully, which was a problem she would address in a moment. Rhett had his coffee. She had hers. The valley stretched out in front of them the way it always did, with its particular combination of beauty and difficulty, and the evidence, in every direction, the water system that ran through it now like a second set of veins. "Do you ever think about what it would have looked like," Rhett said, "if Crowder had gotten what he wanted? The whole valley." She thought about it. "He'd have owned it and broken it," she said. "That's what men like that do with things. They want to possess them, not build them. Once he owned it, there was nothing he could do with it that would have been worth having. You figured that out faster than I did." "I came in without 15 years of history with him," she said. Fresh eyes. He looked at her. She looked back. The particular communication of people who have been through enough together that they don't have to construct every sentence from scratch anymore. "Halverson asked me last week," she said, "if I'd be willing to work with the county on a property records project. They want to standardize the documentation across the territorial land grants. Apparently, my file on Crowder demonstrated that consistent documentation practice prevents the kind of gaps he was exploiting." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "How long would that take?" 6 months, probably. I could do most of it here. Would you want to?" She looked at the valley in the long summer light. At the streams she'd spent years learning to understand. At the cooperative system that she'd built. Document by document. Argument by argument. Jar of honey by jar of honey. "Yes," she said. "Then do it," he said it simply. No qualification. No reservation. The ease of a man who had spent years relearning what trust looked like and had, gradually, learned it. She said, "I'll write to Halverson tomorrow." Below them, Thomas had apparently given up teaching and was now running with the ball held above his head in what he seemed to believe was a threatening manner. His older sister was chasing him. The younger one had moved on from the grass to a caterpillar she'd located, which was a different problem. "The caterpillar," Elowen said. "I see it." Rhett was already getting up. She watched him go down the porch steps and cross the grass to where his daughter was conducting her investigation. And she watched him crouch beside the child and say something she couldn't hear. And the little girl showed him the caterpillar with the absolute confidence of someone presenting a significant discovery to someone she trusted to appreciate it. He looked at it with the same careful, full attention he'd given everything she'd ever shown him. She leaned back in her chair and held her coffee and watched the light move across the valley and let herself be for a moment in exactly this place without looking past it. She thought about a girl of 21 holding a dish towel in a kitchen in October, watching her life arrange itself, without her permission, into a shape she hadn't chosen. She thought about what that girl had believed. She was walking into the cage, the monster, the price her father had paid for his grief and his debt. She thought about what that girl hadn't known yet. That the things you didn't choose could become, over time and through the accumulation of ordinary courage and ordinary stubbornness and ordinary days, the most genuinely yours of anything you'd ever owned. Not because you'd been given them, because you'd stayed. because you'd looked and kept looking past the story everyone else was telling until you could see what was actually there. Because you'd been willing, when it mattered, to bet on the harder truth against the easier one. She had come to this valley as the price of a debt. She had stayed to understand it. She had fought for it when it needed fighting for. She had built something in it that would outlast the crisis that produced it, which was the only kind of building that meant anything. Fear had not made her less. The difficulty had not broken her. The imperfect, complicated, unchoosable circumstances of her life had not determined her. What she'd done inside them had. That was the thing she knew now that the girl with the dish towel hadn't known, and couldn't have been told, because some knowledge only comes through the living of it. Rhett came back up the steps with the youngest on his arm and the caterpillar, apparently, safely relocated to a more appropriate habitat. He sat back down. The child regarded the porch railing with fresh interest. "Watch her," Elowen said. "I'm watching." The summer light held a little longer. Below, Thomas and his sister had settled into something that looked almost like cooperation, which wouldn't last but was worth noticing while it did. The streams in the valley caught the last of the afternoon and threw it back at the sky, all that water running where water was supposed to run, through channels built for it and shared by the people who depended on it. Rhett's hand found hers on the armrest between their chairs. She turned hers over and held on. The way she'd held on the evening they came home from catching Crowder's men at the south fence in the January cold without drama, without announcement, because it was simply where her hand was supposed to be, and they'd both known it long enough that neither of them needed to say so. The evening came on. The children came inside. The valley kept its long, quiet business of being a valley, the water running, the grass growing, the seasons turning over each other with the indifference and the faithfulness of things that don't require anyone's belief to continue being what they are. And inside that ordinary, imperfect, fully inhabited life, two people who had arrived at each other through every wrong circumstance possible held on to what they'd found and did not let go.